he wants to change the conversation from Watergate, but this isn't a good conversation for him either, as it turns out. And certainly not, by the end of January, beginning of February. You have 11-day nationwide trucker strike, which is inconceivable to us today, and the president's just silent throughout all of this. You have literally people, truckers, who are on strike on the side of the road, sniping at truckers who are still running their big rigs, and it's chaotic.
And by sniping, you mean shooting at, and
I do mean shooting at.
I mean, this is the other thing that I realized from reading your book. The reason why trucker culture was so huge at that time was because they were such a huge player in our politics. Over the next, I don't know, 5 or 6 years or something, this is when the whole CB culture was sort of exploding. Yeah. And you write about it as CBs becoming this sort of, town square, sort of common. This is sort of like the Twitter of the day. But all I remember as a kid was the songs and, Smokey and the Bandit. And
right.
There was so many songs. I remember just having cassette recordings of taping the radio where it was breaker, good buddy, and having a CB term book and stuff like that. And so does that last throughout the era? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, filling up at a gas station now becomes, it becomes like this political act, because or not filling up as the case might be. And these truckers, they had been so lionized as sort of these icons of American individualism, these sort of, highway cowboys, but then they become these highway guerrillas. And, they were sort of thought to be kind of conservative. They didn't, the guys who led the strike were not Teamsters. They didn't belong to a union. They sort of rejected that. They supported the war in Vietnam. And here they are, these kind of social conservatives becoming these highway guerrillas, and everyone was on their side because they were doing things like calling for a rollback at the pump, and so a young Senator Joseph Biden sees his chance, and he rides a big rig 536 miles from Delaware to Ohio, and then reports back, I understand, I feel their pain, I understand why they're protesting, and it's kind of amazing. It's not just sort of a strike at one factory, but this is across the whole country. And so you're right, these CBs were sort of like the Twitter of the day, and they sort of build this kind of newly discovered consciousness among the truckers that that they sort of take up the tools of mass action. And it does continue throughout the 70s. So in 79 we have the same thing happen, and in fact in some ways it's much worse because it's happening again. So in 79, when you have a reduction in supply because of the Iranian Revolution, their gas lines form again. And it is worse because it's Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter has promised Americans that he's going to solve the energy crisis. It's under Jimmy Carter that we create the Department of Energy, and it's a disaster when these lines form. And you have the same thing, the anger on the lines, and another trucker strike, and so in the midst of this is when Carter does two things that we remember him for, but we might not remember that they occur as there's gas lines and trucker strikes going on across the country. One is the installing of the solar panels on the White House roof. So that sort of seemed good, but didn't really do anything to alleviate the immediate pain. And the other thing we remember him for, of course, is his famous Melee speech, the Crisis of Confidence speech. And, academics get all excited about this speech, like finally a president's telling Americans, they consume too much and it's their fault and they should be more moral, virtuous people. But this is not what the public wanted to hear at the time.
And this is when they set their thermometers to 65 degrees. And what's interesting, too, about this period is it seems that this is where we enter into sort of a sort of a more modern version and of sort of almost conservative identity politics. It seems to me. I mean, obviously, this stuff is there in a bunch in a myriad of different ways, but that somehow this issue becomes, because it seems like the history of this is that the energy crisis, the oil crunch, whatever, oil, just cheap energy, becomes a pivot point for a whole host of ideologies and players, right? I mean, this is like everybody sort of like wraps their rope around this pole and swings in whichever way they want, or it pulls them into the center of power. You know, I'm talking about, like, Rumsfeld gets mentioned in this as Ford comes up, and Dick Cheney, of course, and like you say, we see this on the left as well. But and we were talking about this, it was amazing, and we entered into we'll have hopefully played this song as an example of what was going on. But the minority freeze, or I should say the focal minority, it's called, freeze a Yankee. And this becomes, like sort of something that we recognize. I mean, to me, it sounds like, on some level, like Donald Trump now, where you get into this notion of it becomes, this battle becomes sort of a way, like a cultural identifier. Tell us what's all.
So you've mapped that trajectory, right? I mean, what you have really from the beginning of my story, which, as we said, starts with George Bush to really sort of the end of the story, is the sort of alliance of conservative Republicans, also with sort of the South, that sort of culminates in Ronald Reagan's election, and sort of this great moment from the 1980 Republican convention, in which Reagan, we forget that one of the things that he is able to sort of build his campaign on is the huge failure of Carter on the energy thing. So for Reagan, this is really exhibit A of what the government messes up and what the government can't do. And so when he delivers his famous line, government is not the solution, government is the problem, he means the energy crisis and the example of that. And so on the floor of the convention, which takes place in Detroit in the summer of 1980, delegates wear buttons that read, "A Democrat shot JR." Which of course is their answer to that sensationalized summer cliffhanger, series-ending cliffhanger on Dallas. J.R. Ewing gets shot. Nobody knows who shot him.
This is a big oil man. We should say he's a big oil man.
So he is sort of like the iconic, American independent oil man. And by 1980, it's clear that Republicans, conservative Southerners, Texans, they think the problem is the Democrats. And as you say, this kind of sectionalism, this kind of polarization on this issue really is felt most strongly in the South and Southwest, where you have all of these energy producers. So it's in the Carter period, in the summer of 1978, that this folk band, the Focal Minority, releases a song "Freeze a Yankee." And the idea is that if those horrible liberals did not control prices, then there would be enough energy. They're talking about natural gas because natural gas was controlled too, but they're talking about all energy. Then there would be enough for everyone. So, so they have great lyrics where they say, Kennedy said he's not going to let us drill off the continental shelf. We could tell them all to go to Hyannisport, this idea that it's the liberal Democrats that are limiting our supply, and so the solution is to just drive your cars as fast as you can, use as much energy as you can, and that will freeze a Yankee, and then they'll come around and change their policy.
And be a little bit more to be a little more explicit about this. You point out. I mean, we have Tip O'Neill, right, in charge of Congress, but he's the Speaker of the House, and Ted Kennedy, who is so prominent that he's challenging Jimmy Carter in a year or so, or has already started to.
Right.
Both these guys are from Massachusetts, and it's the Northeast that is traditionally has the most problem with severe winters, broadly speaking, in terms of getting heating oil. I don't know, why is it always New England as opposed to, let's say, I don't know, Minnesota or something?
Well, it's there too, but, drive 75 and freeze them alive, that's sort of the idea. I mean, partly the answer isn't so interesting because the Northeast is more reliant on heating oil than at least in this period of time, than any other part of the country. So they sort of target it. But, it's people like Les Aspin, other sort of Midwestern liberals who are in favor of the same policies, so that they're part of the coalition.
And this becomes, this. I mean, this. If we haven't already played the song, we're going to play it on the outro here, and maybe it makes more sense to play it at the end so that people understand the sort of the intensity and the sort of the nature. So the issue has become sort of. It has become weaponized in a way. I mean, it starts as a weapon for the producers, but it becomes another sort of arrow in the quiver of conservatives to make this argument. And they're not making this argument during Nixon or Ford, right? That government just can't figure this out. They're only making it over the course of Carter because it becomes more. I mean, is that it? I mean,
well, they start earlier. So, you have Milton Friedman, for him too, the energy crisis is also Exhibit A on the disastrous, policies of liberal government. So he writes, publishes all these, he has a weekly Newsweek column in which he says, the solution to getting rid of the lines is just get rid of controls and we won't have a problem. And so actually the Nixon and Ford administration are interesting because you do have people like William Simon who are saying, if you just fire me and put me out of work and get rid of all of these regulations, everything will be fine. But they're facing this huge liberal Congress. One thing that we forget often when we talk about the 70s is that liberals actually are pretty strong still. We sort of imagine this world of after the 60s they've gone, and by the 80s, but in the 70s they're really still strong, and that's part of the problem. So they just really can't do anything. And then when they're out of the White House in the Carter period, then they really can hammer home. And another element that comes much more to the fore and isn't really on the table in the first oil shock is the role of foreign policy, which we haven't talked too much about.
Right.
So the other song, if the book has sort of a soundtrack to it, would be Cheaper Crude or No More Food, and that's a popular song in 79. And the idea by this period is that we're getting screwed by Arab sheiks, who and also Iran, who have this ability to blackmail us and hold us hostage by their control of oil. So that argument, the idea that we need to, that's where I thought you were going when you said militarize, weaponize. So that argument that the solution isn't just increasing and freeing our domestic market, but going and militarizing the Gulf and protecting those resources reaches culmination in the late 70s and then in the Reagan-Bush era. So
what does that mean? Cheaper crude or no more food? Like you're not going to get support from us anymore, or we're going to cut it off, or what?
Cut it off. So, if we export wheat to you and you won't continue to supply us with the oil that we want, you're not going to get our wheat anymore. That's the argument. and it receives backing from people like Moynihan, and it has this sort of popular currency, even if it's not really based in a reality in the sense of, our dependence on fuel is greater, and their ability to get wheat from elsewhere is greater, but still it sort of has a kind of cultural cachet to it.
What? So, I mean, and I know that we're leaving a little bit of this, or a lot of foreign policy on the table here, but what? I mean, being now 30, 40 years out, 30, almost 35 years out from the first sort of like real clarion call, right? That there's a problem here, and the idea that, and that's first where we get this notion of like, hey, maybe growth isn't sort of like the answer to it all, or this is
right.
These chickens are going to come home to roost. I mean, is this an example of sort of the increasing failure of our system of government being able to address a major problem? I mean, we don't seem to have an energy policy today. I mean, has there been a time we had maybe 6 months during the Carter administration, maybe longer, but that we actually had sort of a genuine energy policy? Or is it just like, just find it where you can find it?
That doesn't sound so catchy, but might have the virtue of being accurate. So when the Arab embargo happens in '73, and Nixon realizes, okay, I have to make some big statement here, which takes him a few weeks to do. What he declares is Project Independence, right? And that's kind of probably wasn't a great idea, because then it sort of articulated, in fact, what the problem as Americans perceived it to be, which was dependence. And unlike today when we talk about energy dependence, like on fossil fuels or whatever, what he meant and what this meant across the spectrum was sort of dependence on foreign oil. So the idea, and this was embraced by Nixon, by Ford, by Carter, is that we would reach self-sufficiency. That was the goal.
By Palin. I mean, drill, baby, drill, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that was sort of the goal, right?
It's still around.
These were the early sort of proponents of drill, baby, drill. That's right. And nuclear, we were going to build 200 more nuclear plants, and, Carter's was sort of more environmentally friendly. So, he had this idea that we would get 20% of our energy needs from the sun. He was certain that he could make that happen. But the idea would be that we would achieve independence from abroad. That really changes with the end of the Cold War. The problem in '73 is we don't have any military response to what was an aggressive act against American interests, because, as you mentioned earlier, this is in the middle of the Cold War, and more than that, this is the country's war weary because of Vietnam. So behind closed doors, there's discussion, can we do anything? And the answer is no, we can't do anything. But when Saddam Hussein moves into Kuwait in 1990, the idea then is Bush says, energy security is national security, and the focus shifts really from independence to security, and sort of an acceptance that it's okay to import.
Because we now have the leverage to make sure that they keep they keep selling to us.
Correct.
And
that's right.
And then the sad thing is that we still have this sort of myth. I mean, obviously it's a world market, but the percentage of oil that we get from the Middle East now is if it's double digits, it's like only around 15%. The rest we get from maybe Venezuela and Canada, I guess. It is a world market. But now it's really also, it seems to me that the '93 invasion of Kuwait was about us having learned the lesson that, like, hey, this is a really potent weapon. Just having control of oil is a potent weapon. We should get ourselves in this game of being able to, at the very least, project some ability to cut off maybe China's oil or something to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, this started. You mentioned Rumsfeld and Cheney. They do appear in my story. They are sort of along with Bush, sort of perfect examples of these Washington insiders, people who shift government to the right from within. It's an interesting parallel today because, of course, Ted Cruz is sort of the ultimate insurgent, but he's
Right.
a senator, so we could talk about that too. So these guys, are pushing Washington to the right from inside, and they start in the Nixon administration, and they really become quite powerful in the Ford administration as Chief of Staff and Secretary of Defense. They are in favor of a more enhanced military in the Middle East. They just really, their hands are tied. And it's only after the Soviets invade Afghanistan, not even after the hostage crisis, but only after the Soviets invade Afghanistan, that Carter makes his big Carter Doctrine speech in his State of the Union address in 1980 that says, any attempt to shut down the Persian Gulf and limit access to oil will be seen as an attack on our national interest, and we'll use any force necessary to defend. And that's a pivot. It's not one that's realized really until Operation Desert Storm in 1991.
So, lastly, is the story here? And I guess is the story here that that oil is, or energy is, a fundamental is such a fundamental undergirding of our politics? I mean, at some level, this was a time where it was sort of very obvious. Now it's weird because we're paying, and I don't know in inflation dollars if we're really paying that much, or we were at $4 a gallon. I mean, the idea that you can get gas now under $2 a gallon just seems weird to me. But in the final analysis, is it that cheap energy and energy is so relevant to our politics in a way that we're not even conscious of it? Or is it, and maybe these are not mutually exclusive, that because this energy was a power source, literally for like a political power source for the right, just by happenstance, right? I mean, I guess in an alternate reality, we had solar farms and all these, green activists, took power. Is it this is what has empowered the right, is because they happen to own the, sort of this incredibly important aspect of our society, which we don't really sort of see on a daily basis? Or
I have to say, and I don't think you'll disagree with this, Sam, the commitment to cheap energy is really a bipartisan issue,
right.
Because ultimately, it's something Americans care about deeply. And so as much progress as we have made in controlling emissions in Paris and Obama using executive authority, it still doesn't address the underlying reality that American consumption continues to increase, and Americans continue to expect cheap prices. So, the two headline bits of news today is that OPEC can't stabilize the market, so there's going to be low prices. So that's good for consumers and bad for the environment. And Obama's about to go to Saudi Arabia. So, even as oil prices are low, we still see the cost in terms of sort of ongoing military commitment and alliance with these powerful players. I would say that because we have this sort of fundamental conviction that Americans have a right to cheap and abundant energy, that ended up playing into the hands of Republicans because it was when government could not deliver on that promise that it helped to undermine and delegitimize government as a whole. So, if Vietnam and Watergate taught us that we could not trust our politicians, it was the energy crisis of the 70s that taught us that government didn't work. And that's what ended up was sort of the final nail in the coffin and ended up giving momentum to this sort of anti-government argument that the right has used so successfully. And
the fascinating thing is obviously Democrats can't make the argument for reasons that it goes against their sort of their political ethos anyways. They can't explicitly say government works now that gas is under $2 a gallon. However, the Democratic nominee, whoever that ends up being, is probably going to benefit significantly from gasoline prices.
There's a poll that there's a poll that shows that the Moody poll came out, said, okay, we can have all the debates and all of the primaries and whatever, but with gas prices, at these sort of historic lows, that those will benefit the Democrats. So we'll see. We'll see.
Cue the right-wing conspiracy theories about Obama's trip to Saudi Arabia as he probably, by all accounts, probably he's just offering fealty to Islam to get in return cheaper gasoline until his Islamic brethren can take over the United States. I know you don't endorse that part of the the argument, Meg. I'm not going to make
I didn't go there.
Indeed. Panic at the Pump. We have a link at majority.fm. The Energy Crisis and the Transformation of American Politics in the 1970s. Meg Jacobs, thanks so much for your time today. It's a fascinating read, and I know Matt here in the office is going to grab it out of my arms as soon as we are done talking.
Thanks so much, Sam. It was fun talking to you.
And we're going to play that focal minority. I love that pun. Freeze a Yankee now. Thanks, Meg. Hi, I'm Sam Seder, and this is an Ann Coulter doll.
You should not be immigrating here. Yeah. Stay in your country and hate us.
For smart progressive talk and a little bit of this and even a little bit of that.
Mission accomplished.
Subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like us on Facebook to get some of our best video clips.